Hello, welcome to the 8/16-bit music workshop. I'm your club princess. Without any further ado, let's just get started. You might be wondering to yourself why older video game music sounds like that. And the reason for that is primarily because of technological and space constraints. Back when the first video game consoles were starting to be made, audio playback was not as feasible because of these space constraints. As an example, I have this MP3 file of the original Zelda Overworld music that I had on my desktop. You can see that the file size, according to my computer, is 598 kilobytes, which is a problem considering that the original Legend of Zelda, its cartridge size, 128 kilobytes. I believe that the largest cartridges were like at max 1 megabyte, and a lot of other things, like a lot of other NES games, were significantly smaller. So you can see that this is an issue, especially that MP3 is already compressed file format. So if you can't just play back sound files, then how can you create sound? Well, the way that older video game consoles did this was by just actually creating the sound in real time. Sequences of notes would be read from like a file and then would trigger a dedicated sound creation module on the sound chip. This resulted in two distinct types of sounds: 8-bit and 16-bit. Uh, these two types of sounds are not necessarily distinct. Many of the sound chips used in older consoles had the capability of doing both. For example, the NES had one DCPM slot which could be used to play some very rudimentary sound fonts. However, most NES games only used the other channels. Before I talk about the intricacies of 8-bit and 16-bit sounds, I want to talk about a limitation that affected both: polyphony. Polyphony is the capability to play multiple notes simultaneously. For example, here's the RP2A03 chip in the NES. You can see its channels here. It had two pulse waves, one triangle wave, the aforementioned DPCM channel, and one white noise channel. The white noise channel did not have a pitch. That means there were only four melodic voices possible when you're using the RP2A03 chip. You might notice that this might be an issue because triadic chords, which are exceptionally common in music, especially modern music, they need three voices. If you only have one more voice after that, after you're playing a whole chord, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to create music. So how are you supposed to create interesting music when you have very, very little polyphony? The main thing is compositional techniques. Here are a few that are useful. The first of these would be arpeggiation. Arpeggiation is playing the notes of a chord as an arpeggio, which is playing the notes of the chord one at a time as opposed to playing them simultaneously. The biggest example I can think of is the Kirby soundtrack. For example, here is Green Greens from the first Kirby game. As a note, these compositional techniques actually had an influence on some later video game music, even when these limitations of polyphony stopped existing. For example, this is the track that plays when you fight against Mask DDD in the DS game, Kirby Superstar Ultra. Another of these compositional techniques is the use of counterpoint. Counterpoint, or using a contrapuntal sound, is writing multiple parts so that they sound like disparate melodies as opposed to one unified sound. This would be the opposite of the idea of homophony, where instead you're trying to make multiple voices sound like one unified sound. Counterpoint is, to put it short, very hard. All the intricacies of counterpoint is not something that I can cover within the scope of this workshop. So unfortunately, you might have to do some studying, and unfortunately, there's this one guy who's really good at counterpoint. His name is J.S. Bach. So yeah, study your classical music. It's not all useless, even if it doesn't sound as much to your tastes. One of the best examples of counterpoint, especially in early games, is its usage in the original Pokemon Red and Blue soundtrack. The last of these is rhythmic interest. Rhythmic interest is just driving interest through variation in rhythm as opposed to harmonic interest. Because interesting driving rhythms can, help create a catchy and interesting song without requiring the use of complex harmonic techniques that need multiple voices. Zelda 2 uses rhythmic interest very powerfully, especially in its temple theme. Another example of rhythmic interest could be seen in Fire Emblem Gaiden in its track with Mila's Divine Protection. You might recognize this track because it was interesting enough that it actually got a remaster in an entirely new Latin style in the game Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Let's talk about 8-bit instrumentation. 8-bit era cards were essentially rudimentary synthesizers. They produced simple, pure waves like triangle, square, pulse, sine, or sawtooth waves, with capabilities to automate some other simple things like pitch or pulse width. Some of the cards of that era even had complex FM synthesis channels, for example, the Sega Genesis. As an example, here's an iconic theme from the Sonic games. Pretty much any modern synthesizer, be that a VST plugin like Helm or one built into your DAW like Serum, or even like a physical analog synth from a company like Moog, can create simple waves pretty easily. However, some old sound chips had their quirks that caused imperfections in their waves that gave them a unique character. Some VSTs that you can find online can simulate these imperfections. For example, Magical 8-Bit Plug simulates the imperfections of the NES's sound chip. There's also tracker software. Some modern tracker software like FamiTracker lets you emulate the workflow of programming music for an actual old console and has been used to create music that can even be played on cartridges of that work with those old consoles. Alright, now let's talk about 16-bit instrumentation. 16-bit instrumentation is defined by its usage of sound fonts, which is a type of sample-based music, where samples are played back at different pitches in order to simulate actual instruments being played. Sample-based music is actually very, very powerful now, and many samples and types of sound fonts and plugins that use samples are now very, very good actually, and sometimes can even be indistinguishable from the real thing, which is not the case for 16-bit music. But another reason why 16-bit instrumentation sounds the way it does is because of the sample's quality. To understand lower quality of samples, we also have to talk about digital audio in case you don't know how it works. When we take a video and we convert it to digital, we aren't able to render the image exactly down to the molecular level. That would be extremely difficult and extremely expensive. Instead, we approximate the image using an array of pixels. Our modern monitors, for example, at our whatever resolutions, our 1080p, our 4K, are able to render enough pixels that we don't even perceive the pixels anymore, and they refresh fast enough that we can't notice that there are individual frames being played with a video. Previously, this wasn't really the case with older video games, which is why pixel art is a thing, for example. But what we do with images and with videos, which is approximate them, we can just do that same thing with a sound wave. Sound waves are just the way that an amount of air compression or amplitude changes over time. We can't represent every single continuous amplitude at every single possible instance. What we can do is take a sample of the sound every so often and approximate the amplitude in decibels of that sample and represent that approximation using a binary number. The sample rate of a digital audio file is how frequently the sample is taken. The bit depth is how many bits we have in order to represent that sample's amplitude. Uh, our modern minimum standard for sound is, well, if you know about the compact disc or CDs, yes, I'm talking about like the metal discs with the hole in the center. The CD standard uses a sample rate of 44.1 kilohertz, which is 44,100 samples per second, with a bit depth value of 16, which is 65,536 possible values. These were not feasible back then, so, back then, both the sample rate and the bit depth were significantly less. The fact that samples were kind of noisy was caused by the sample rate, and the fact that the dynamics are kind of flat of many sound font samples is caused by the bit depth. Of course, older game consoles are not exactly a monolith. They're really hard to generalize, but for example, the GBA had about 13 kilohertz sample rate and about 8-bit depth, which is significantly less because I believe that is 256 values compared to the 65,000 of 16-bit depth. Pretty much any modern sound recording can have its quality changed using a plugin called a bit crusher. The bit crusher is commonly used in lo-fi music, which is an entire genre of music about losing audio fidelity in a creative way. So it's pretty likely that a digital audio workstation software has a bit crusher as a stock plugin. Of course, you don't actually need to make your own samples. Lots of people have ripped sound fonts from old video games and just use those. The biggest example I can think of is Toby Fox using the Earthbound soundtrack in a lot of his music in Undertale Deltarune. For example, the main melody in Ghost Fight and Dummy actually uses the same instrument from the Earthbound track Venus Live. Spamton's themes like Now's Your Chance to Be a and Big Shot use a wow sound effect from the opening track for Earthbound, which is called Now Let's Go. And of course, there's this song, which is played during the second to last boss in Earthbound, called Pokey Means Business. And it might be hard to recognize because the guitar is a bit deeper, but that guitar sound font is the same one being used in this song. I am going to warn you, it's kind of a legal gray area to do this, but I mean, if Toby Fox can do it, it's probably fine, maybe. But speaking of Toby Fox, you might notice that he uses these in combination with modern sound fonts and effects pretty frequently, which brings me to my last point. Do you need to be 100% faithful to how older consoles sounded? Not really. Lots of pixel art games don't have 8-bit soundtracks. Think of games like Enter the Gungeon or FTL Faster Than Light. Both of those games use electronic soundtracks that are inspired, but not necessarily 100% accurate to how sound fonts would sound back then. Like Toby Fox showed, 8-bit, 16-bit sounds can be used in addition to modern sounds very effectively. As a non-game example, if you ever heard of the artist Snail's House, they use a lot of chiptune sound effects in their music mixed with a lot more modern sounds. Basically, you can just do what you want. You can use whatever sound effects you like, whatever techniques you like. But I will say that sometimes limitations can breed creativity. So if limiting yourself to the limitations of older consoles can help you be creative, feel free to do so since, limitation breeds creativity. Alright, that's basically everything that I have for you. Thank you so much for coming to the workshop.